The Australian Financial Review.
When US Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced progress this week on a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia, he opted for a strange analogy.
What's back on track here, hopefully, is peace. This is serious stuff. This is not Mean Girls. This is not some episode of some television show. This is very serious. Today, people will die.
The problem for Rubio is that Donald Trump's handling of foreign affairs in recent weeks has been exactly like an episode of Mean Girls. From the drama of the Oval Office clash with Volodymyr Zelensky,
You think you're gambling with World War III.
to the war of words with Malcolm Turnbull,
If you suck up to bullies, whether it's in the global affairs or in the playground, you just get more bullying.
Donald Trump has thrown the norms of diplomacy out the window and replaced them with threats and demands. For Australia, that means being hit with a 25% tariff on about $1 billion worth of steel and aluminium exports. It also means pressure to lift defence spending by billions of dollars. This new transactional approach to world affairs has created uncertainty over national security, just as Australia heads into a federal election. And it comes as Australia has been warned to expect more Chinese warships in the region.
All of a sudden now, the presence of Chinese ships off the Australian coast and the broader strategic situation with Trump means that national security will be an issue at this election.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent Andrew Tillett and International Affairs expert James Curran on how Donald Trump has disrupted the world order, whether Australia can still rely on the US as its key security partner, and why we are headed for a khaki-tinged election. It's Thursday, March 13. Hi James, hi Andrew, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Great to be here, Lisa and James.
James, it's been a dramatic few weeks in world affairs, and one of the key moments was that Oval Office clash between Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump and JD Vance. You're a historian. Where does that encounter sit in the history of world leader confrontations? And what does the clash and the fallout tell us about Trump's geopolitical strategy?
So I think normally historians would have to wait 20 to 30 years to see the transcript of a confrontation like that. Normally, what's presented to the public is the platitudinous grab bag of, warm relations, sentiment, common interests, and all the dirty laundry is aired in the back room. On this occasion, though, we had a very public, open, brutal kind of mugging of a wartime leader in Zelensky in the White House. The day didn't begin well because the moment that Zelensky arrived at the White House, he of course was wearing his military uniform. Trump said, "Oh, look, he's dressed up for the occasion."
He's all dressed up today.
It all descended once JD Vance, the Vice President, got involved.
With respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media.
And then it was just, as I say, a sort of a ganging up on Zelensky.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting?
You're gambling with World War III.
There was Trump making the irrefutable point that Ukraine would not be where it was today had it not been for American military support and backing.
If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin, in 3 days.
But Zelensky saying, look, I've tried the diplomatic route with Putin. He's untrustworthy.
He broken this ceasefire. He killed our people and he didn't exchange prisoners.
He's been untrustworthy before. What makes you think he'll stick to the ceasefire this time?
She's asking, what if Russia breaks the ceasefire?
What if anything? What if a bomb drops on your head right now?
And of course, Trump, sticking up for Putin, said that Putin would guarantee this.
I don't know. They broke it with Biden because Biden, they didn't respect him. They didn't respect Obama. They respect me.
Two very different views, but in essence, just such a brutal exposition of Trump's transactional approach. I mean, we hear so much about his transactionalism, but here it was before the eyes of the world.
President Trump has paused military support to Ukraine following his continuing clash with President Zelensky.
It just underlines that the Trump approach is about contempt for the old order, a lust for power, a kind of a perverse enjoyment of the shock and horror that this kind of causes around the world, and putting other allies on notice.
And James, former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull got the Zelensky treatment this week. Trump called Turnbull a weak and ineffective leader after he criticised the US president.
He sure did, and Trump was really riled up, I think, by Turnbull's personal attack.
I think China will take advantage, massive advantage of Trump.
Turnbull called Trump
Chaotic, rude and abusive. Trump is erratic.
That was enough to draw Trump's ire on social media, and I think he was probably also perturbed by the point that Turnbull was making that basically Trump's way of handling tariffs and handling allies is creating an opportunity for Xi Jinping to look the statesman, to look in control, to look ordered, to look more trustworthy.
Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull joins me now. Mr Turnbull, was it reckless to be going to the media and offering criticism of Donald Trump in this pivotal week?
But I think Turnbull's speaking the truth to power.
Are you suggesting that we should engage in self-censorship in Australia for fear of offending the huge ego of Donald Trump? Is that really the state that we've got to?
Other world leaders have been doing this in Europe and in Canada. So it was good to see an Australian, I think, throw down the gauntlet to this president.
So how is Australia positioned to deal with what you call Trump's brutal transactionalism?
At the time we're going to air, it's looking less and less likely we will get an exemption from steel and aluminium tariffs. And that is a difference from the first Trump term, where we educated him about alliances and mateship and how steadfast we'd stood by America in a lot of the world wars and conflicts last century and this one. That doesn't seem to be working this time. But if you do adopt this transactional ledger, if Trump was to look at what else Australia is doing, the US has a trade surplus with Australia. Trump cares about that. So that's a big tick. Then you look at Australia's policy over the last 15 years especially, where it has agreed to host the rotation of US Marines through Darwin, provided a string of airports across the top of the country that US Air Forces can use, hosting B-52 bombers, on top of Pine Gap, the crucial intelligence facility which remains so important to US homeland defence, but also US cyber warfare and general US warfighting capability, and with the coming submarine-based construction south of Perth. I mean, you couldn't get a greater sort of continental gift, as it were, that Australia is stepping up and doing more and more for the US alliance in this part of the world and becoming the most crucial cog, apart from Japan, in terms of the US's capacity to push back against Chinese assertiveness. So on that score, I mean, if Trump was to look at this ledger, he would surely find that Australia is crucial in terms of what it provides geographically to the US position in Asia.
Yeah, but as James just said, that hasn't worked out for us in the case of getting an exemption on steel and aluminium tariffs with those negotiations that Trump has imposed. So I think in terms of security, while we do have a lot of credit in the bank, I don't think Trump will necessarily see it that way. Trump sees countries freeloading off the US security umbrella. You know, he's very critical of South Korea and Japan, where US troops are stationed in significant numbers. We like to think that the US is doing the world a favour in terms of its security presence. Trump just sees it as a burden. There were some interesting comments from Singapore's Defence Minister last month, where he said that the US image in Asia was changing from that of liberator to a landlord seeking rent. And I think Trump will certainly try and push that view with countries, including with Australia. I mean, the fact that we've had the real estate of offering Darwin and Perth in terms of those military bases might be wonderful, but he'll certainly be saying, well, look, you know, we're putting thousands of US personnel in here where you guys don't have to. So there's a little bit of cut and thrust there, but I don't think Trump sort of sees us necessarily doing the US a favour in terms of that.
So, Andrew, separately from the fireworks in the Oval Office, Australia's been dealing with its own security issues in recent weeks. Chinese warships conducted live fire drills in the Tasman Sea, and the government found out about those from commercial pilots. Those warships have been circumnavigating Australia. Do you think China is deliberately doing these exercises at a time when US allies are on edge?
I don't think it's a coincidence, Lisa, but it does sort of need to be put in some perspective. These live fire drills, they've happened in international waters, unambiguously international waters, about 600 kilometres off the east coast of Australia. They were legal, as our government has sort of pointed out constantly throughout this time. This is not like doing something off Wedding Cake Island in Sydney, for instance. I mean, look, Chinese ships, they haven't been strangers to our waters, but we haven't seen them so far down the east coast, and certainly not circumnavigating Australia in the way that they did. It's sort of perhaps brought home the old anxiety that we sort of feel here in Australia. You know, for a long time we've relied on the tyranny of distance to keep us safe, and the flotilla's presence showed very much that clearly is not the case anymore. And so we saw this sort of really strong reaction in the media. And
well, the ADF is today monitoring 3 Chinese warships lurking in Australian waters.
On Friday, Australia and New Zealand given little warning of a possible live fire exercise by China's warships.
It would be appropriate to have been given more warning.
It sort of brings it home in a way that we've never seen before. But by the same token, but which countries which are much closer to China live with on a daily basis, countries like the Philippines or Vietnam or Taiwan. But, you know, it sort of highlights the fact that we've got such an ageing navy, that resources are being stretched, and a lot of consternation over the fact of just 3 Chinese warships, which is just a tiny fraction of their navy, and yet it tied up so much of the resources on our end. So there's perhaps a sense here emerging that we might have to focus more on our home game, our home defence, rather than necessarily being able to head back out into the region. And vice versa, we're sort of seeing this message from China that it's now got the military muscle and the capability to project much further beyond its immediate waters out into the wider Pacific.
So, Andrew, all of this is starting to find its way into the political debate in the lead up to the federal election. Will this be a Khaki election?
A couple of months ago, I wouldn't have said it was going to be a Khaki election, you know, one where it's dominated by issues such as defence spending, national security. You know, there was obviously so much focus about cost of living and the various sorts of issues that stem for that. I think the election will still be largely around that issue, but there is certainly now a whiff of a Khaki emerging. It's something that Peter Dutton feels very comfortable with, you know, as the sort of conservative hard man of politics, a former defence minister, a hawk on China in terms of their defence spending. You know, we had Peter Dutton a couple of weeks ago promising $3 billion for new fighter jets. More broadly, the coalition's promising to spend more sooner on defence, although hasn't quite said how much that's going to be and how they're going to pay for it.
There's discussion at the moment about potential peacekeeping.
Anthony Albanese, in the last week or so, has come out quite firmly, quite surprisingly perhaps, on the idea of Australian peacekeepers being sent to Ukraine.
And from my government's perspective, we're open to consideration of any proposals going forward.
The fact that the PM was so forward-leading on it, it suggests that he sees this as a way perhaps to occupy a bit of the national security space and counter it, particularly given that Peter Dutton has made it clear that he's opposed to the idea of sending Australian troops to Ukraine.
In terms of whether we should have boots on the ground in Ukraine, I don't support that. I think the Europeans have that task, and I think what President Trump's pointed out is that the Europeans need to do more.
But we're seeing with this week the US lifting its pause on military aid and intelligence sharing after Zelensky had some talks with Marco Rubio in Saudi Arabia, and we look like we're inching hopefully towards a ceasefire deal. So we've got this situation where Albanese's considering it, Dutton is firmly against it, and here we are a few weeks out from our own election campaign getting underway properly. So this could very well end up being an issue that bubbles up as Australians prepare to go and vote in a few weeks' time.
Well, I think it's interesting to note that security is once more to the fore of the public debate right on the cusp of an election. Now, this happened in 2022 when virtually on the day the election was called, we had the announcement that the Solomon Islands were going to do some kind of deal with China in terms of access to ports there and a security agreement of some type. Now, that occasion said that the Morrison government, which had been so keen to project its China pushback credentials, had taken its eye off the local Pacific ball, as it were. Now we've got the Labor Party in government, which for 3 years has been so careful not to open up really much daylight between themselves and the coalition opposition on matters like how to handle China or the US alliance, and particularly the AUKUS agreement. All of a sudden now, the presence of Chinese ships off the Australian coast and the broader strategic situation with Trump means that national security will be an issue at this election. Lisa, the other point here is that the US is actually now stepping up the pressure on Australia. I mean, last week in the US Congress, we had Trump's nominee for Undersecretary of Defence for Policy at the Pentagon, Elbridge Colby, come out and say that Australia did need to spend more on defence. Perhaps even more importantly, he cast further doubt, which he has before, but he cast further doubt on whether or not we would actually get the Virginia-class submarines under the AUKUS agreement. And he said that if the Taiwan tensions intensify, it would be crazy for the US to sell Australia those submarines. So we're on notice. AUKUS is looking less and less certain than ever.
Andrew, we're talking about the precarious state of the world and how Australia is positioned to respond. Elbridge Colby, Trump's choice to be head of policy at the Pentagon, said last week that Australia should be spending 3% of GDP on defence. Are we spending enough, and are we spending the money on the right things?
That's the $56 billion question, perhaps. You know, we spend $56 billion a year on defence. Are we getting value? Is it being spent wisely? I mean, there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of delays, bungles with projects. More money may not necessarily be the answer. We have this sort of fixation about, are we spending a certain percentage of GDP on defence? It's around about 2% at the moment. That was sort of seen as the benchmark for a long time. I remember Tony Abbott back in 2013 campaigning on that would be lifting it to 2% of GDP. Elbridge Colby, in his confirmation hearing, was talking about 3% of GDP. 3% adds around probably about $25 billion a year to annual Australian defence spending. It's a view that, you know, some of the eminent greybeards in the Australian defence establishment have put out there, people like the former military chief Sir Angus Houston, the former Defence Department Secretary Dennis Richardson, and Mike Bozzullo, who authored the 2009 Defence White Paper. They're all fans of the 3% benchmark as well. Colby on AUKUS said some interesting things in his Senate testimony last week.
You know, the idea of empowering our Australian, in some sense, perhaps our closest ally in the world, it's a great idea for them to have attack submarines.
It's probably a bit more nuanced than people sort of want to perhaps give it credit for. This is a guy who was a sceptic of AUKUS. He's probably still got some concerns, but he sort of phrases it in terms of, look, we've got to make sure that we can build up the industrial base to build submarines for both us and Australia.
If we can produce the attack submarines in sufficient number and sufficient speed, then great. But if we can't, that becomes a very difficult problem because we don't want our servicemen and women to be in a weaker position and more vulnerable because they're not in the right place in the right time.
But he makes it very clear, though, that if that can't be achieved, he's got grave doubts about the idea of transferring submarines to the Australian Navy. There's no promise that we'll get the submarines, and there's no refund clause from what we understand if we don't.
Quite clearly, the rate of production of US nuclear submarines is simply not up to where it needs to be in order for them to feel comfortable with giving us submarines. So at some point, there is going to have to be a consideration in government of what the alternative is, because we may well be left with no submarine capability at all.
So the world is certainly moving towards a more heavily armed, militarised war footing. We're seeing like China talking about increasing their defence spending by more than 7% this year. At times it feels like the debate here is still stuck in the starting blocks. There's not really much focus on making defence more efficient and making sure we're getting proper value for money. The Defence Strategic Review that this government commissioned, it talked more about emphasis on missiles. We're seeing that with the government trying to set up missile factories here in Australia. We've got people like Hugh White, the respected defence strategist. He sort of talked a lot about the idea of home defence, that we need more submarines to stay closer to the Australian shoreline to offer a more direct defence. And also to, more anti-ship missiles and things like that to try and attack a flotilla of enemy vessels that are coming this way. So the idea that perhaps a war would be fought in an expeditionary sense, that we would have to go and to the enemy's home turf to fight. I think this is all starting to be flipped around on its head. Not so much about bringing the fight to the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, but the fight coming to us here.
I mean, the Colby evidence to Congress really puts Australia into a difficult kind of pincer movement. Here they are being told, like other allies, to increase their spending on defence to get up to 3%. But at the same time, the AUKUS agreement is put in further doubt. Now, it doesn't necessarily follow that if Australia spends more on defence, the AUKUS arrangement will work in terms of the submarines. They are under a different set of challenges relating to US naval shipbuilding and the delays in getting US battle fleet numbers up to where they need to be. So that AUKUS agreement looks ever more like a ghost fleet as they slip further into the mist.
James, all of this disruption and uncertainty has led to a debate about whether this is the end of the Western Alliance as we know it, particularly that clash in the Oval Office. Will any other country move in to fill the leadership vacuum left by the United States?
I think it's certainly true that Trump is doing his level best to drive a pretty sharp kind of knife through the glue that holds both sides of the Atlantic together. I mean, the NATO treaty is the gold standard for American treaty obligations. An attack on one is an attack on all. It's been the very basis for European security since the end of World War II. It really exemplified, the US preparedness to take on the task, if you like, of global governance. Now all that is under threat. Now, the Europeans are standing up. I think they've been jolted by events. Macron is saying that he could possibly provide the French nuclear deterrent for the rest of Europe. The Germans are considering nuclear weapons. Berlin is putting its hand in its fiscal pockets in a way that it hasn't done before and pouring 900 billion euros into infrastructure and defence. Quite extraordinary for the Germans to be doing this. So I think there will be a real effort on the part of the Europeans as well to sort of flock to Ukraine's assistance. The broader point about what's happening in Europe too is what is the ricochet effect in terms of US credibility in the eyes of other allies around the world. That has always been the big concern for the United States. Now, here in the week that Trump is undermining NATO, which has this pretty cast-iron security guarantee, there's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese asked whether the ANZUS treaty is rock solid, and he says yes. But the relevant article in ANZUS is only about a commitment to consult. So I have never heard a Prime Minister sound so absolute about this rock-solid guarantee of ANZUS. It simply doesn't exist.
Andrew, does what's happening in Europe embolden Xi Jinping to think about making a move on Taiwan? How worried do you think the Australian government is about that?
I don't think it emboldens Xi Jinping necessarily. But if you look at the other side of the coin first, I think, Taiwan certainly would be feeling much more worried about whether the US would come to its aid in the event of an invasion. But the Trump administration is full of a lot more China hawks who see China as the main game geopolitically. Institutionally, the US Defence Force has sort of been talking for a while about the threat that China poses and have sort of penciled in 2027 as the key year when China will have both the military means and capabilities to invade Taiwan and also to the symbolism of it being the 100th year anniversary of the PLA's founding. Over the weekend, out of the Chinese two sessions, their top political gathering, there was some very strong language there about Taiwan, the Chinese army talking about tightening the noose against any idea of independence. And Trump himself has been sort of very ambiguous over the so-called strategic ambiguity, the idea about whether or not where the US leaves it open to the question of whether it would come to defend Taiwan. Trump, consistent with his thinking around about reducing everything to trade, has also been critical of Taiwan, particularly around its dominance in microchips and semiconductors, seeing this as of another country cutting the US's lunch. So there's sort of this very much real question around if the US had come to it. But at the same time, China's got big problems, with their economy slowing. Is it in a position of wanting to invade Taiwan? And I think Xi Jinping would be very, very brave and very foolhardy to think that he could invade Taiwan and get away with it consequence-free.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Andrew. I don't necessarily see this as the moment when China goes for it and attempts to take Taiwan. I think what is more on the minds of policymakers in Seoul and Tokyo, Manila and Canberra is a touch of nervousness about what is happening in terms of the US and China talking about a potential understanding or a potential grand bargain or some kind of agreement. Now, I'm not predicting a new Shanghai communique. I'm not predicting enduring peace or the end of strategic competition between the two countries. But if there is some kind of understanding between the two, and overnight we've had talk of a Trump-Xi summit in June around the time of their respective birthdays, which are one day after the other, can we really be sure, given that the Europeans weren't consulted about America's approach to the Ukraine war, can we be sure that Asian allies will be in the consultation loop on any kind of deal with China? So I think we need to be alert and on guard that this Washington under Trump may not necessarily bring Canberra or other Asian allies into their confidence in terms of what is occurring with Washington, Beijing.
So the risk is less about an invasion of Taiwan and more about being left out of any agreement between the US and China on that front.
I think that's right.
So a final question. We seem to be on this roller coaster ride with Trump and we have to strap ourselves in for another 4 years. How do you think Australia will come out of this? Does there need to be an overhaul of our foreign affairs and defence strategy?
I think the answer to that question perhaps lies in just how enduring Trump can be in remaking US foreign policy. The changes he's bringing in place, will they survive a transition to another president? I mean, obviously, if there's a Democrat elected in 4 years' time, we'll perhaps move back to more a sense of America being a good global citizen and internationalist and things like that. But, if Trump's a successor is J.D. Vance or someone else from the MAGA faction of the US Republican Party, I think that's going to have some very profound soul-searching, not just in Canberra, but around the world about, well, right, this is just not the US checking out for 4 years. This is now a structural change to how the US goes about the business in the world. So I think at that point is perhaps when we can answer this question about whether we need to sort of have a deeper change of foreign affairs and defence policy. In the interim, try not to provoke Trump, particularly where it can be avoided, and just manage it almost on a day-by-day basis.
I think that's right. And I also think it's right. You've got to take Trump one day at a time, one step at a time, because he is so unpredictable and he goes back on positions on a whim and he can turn on a dime. But the point is, we are watching in real time the ebbing of Pax Americana. And, in the past, Australia hasn't done end of empires very well. Our reaction has typically been, well, this is unimaginable. How can our great power protector not be interested in Australia? How can there be this prospect of betrayal? How can we be having the fear of abandonment again? Well, it is very much imaginable now. I mean, if you had me up against the wall, I would say it's not going to happen. The US will not retreat from Asia anytime soon. But I do think it's time to get cracking on some fresh thinking. And, there's lots of talk now in Canberra about the need to think about a plan B for AUKUS, for a more self-reliant defence policy, if America can't be relied upon. It's time really, I think, to sort of ditch the stale platitudes that are chock full of sentiment or awash in mateship. That's not going to cut the ice with Trump, and it's probably not going to cut the ice with his successors.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Andrew.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Great to chat.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent Andrew Tillett, and International Affairs expert James Curran reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow. Lap Fan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. And just a heads up, once the federal election campaign kicks off, The Fin will be releasing a special weekly podcast. Every Tuesday, I'll be joined by political editor Phil Curry and our other Canberra experts to break down the big issues. If you want to be ahead of the game, send us in your questions for the political panel. Email thefin@afr.com. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.